Audio on demand from Vision Christian Media.
Jesus said, "If you hold to my teachings, you are really my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free."
A mother said to her young boy once, "I'm just going down the road to get a few things. Now, while I'm out, I don't want you to go into the food cupboard and touch the cookie jar." Immediately she said that, the boy started thinking, cookie jar. When is Mum going out? I want to get into that cookie jar. And that's how the law works. It actually has the opposite effect of what we want it to accomplish. It actually puts in our minds a desire to do the very things it's forbidding us to do. That's what Paul says when he discusses the nature of the law in Romans chapter 7 and verse 5. He says this, "When we were in the flesh, the sinful passions which were aroused by the law were at work in our members to bear fruit to death." God's answer to living above sin is not through the law, it's by the power of His grace.
This is Set Free with Ken Legg.
And we've been getting our teeth into the subject of legalism the last couple of days, particularly how do you escape legalism? It's done a lot of harm to many Christians over the years, and it's damaged the church's reputation, and worst of all, it's misrepresented God. So the question is, why do we still take the bait? Probably like that little boy with the cookie. With us to discuss this issue is Ken Legg. And why, Ken? Why do we take that bait?
Well, Phil, let's remember this, that before we beat up on ourselves, that even Paul himself fell into this trap. You know, I quoted at the beginning of the program from Romans chapter 7, which is a chapter where he kind of even shares his own experience of trying to live under the law, but failing. You know, he says the good that I wanted to do, which I thought, I saw it in the law. I want to be like that. I couldn't do it. And the bad that I didn't want to do, I found myself continuously doing. In fact, what happened is the more he tried to marry himself to the law, the harder this battle become, because the strength of sin is the law. He says this in verse 11, he says that he was actually deceived in this whole process. He thought, here's the law. It's got this high standard, and yes, I want to do that, and yes, I want to be that person. He said, when I went that way, I was deceived, I was taken in, I fell into the trap of thinking that this is the way to holiness, but it's not. So, we're not alone. Paul, as I say, walked that way, and I guess that we do it because we're basically works-oriented. I think there are certain misconceptions that we have about the law and about grace. For example, people believe that laws will actually help them to lead a better life. If you want someone to change, give them a whole bunch of rules. But really, it does the opposite. Coming back to Paul again, verse 8, he says this, "Sin, taking opportunity by the law or by the commandment, produced in me all manner of evil desire. For apart from the law, sin was dead." So, the law comes along and sin revives all of a sudden. It's all on again, and we've got this huge battle, and it's the law that's stirring that up. Now, the law is not bad in itself. We've said that, and we need to keep saying that point. We're not denigrating the law. We're not downplaying it in any way, shape, or form. It's just that our marriage to the law is not a good thing. It's a sterile relationship. And it is weak because the power base for keeping the law is the flesh. Paul says this in verse 3 of chapter 8. He said, "What the law could not do, in that it was weak through the flesh." That's where it breaks down. It's our marriage to it is just not a good partnership at all.
The great example there you gave before of the little boy, his mother says, "Don't touch those cookies." Yeah. Of course, what's he thinking straight away? Can't wait till Mum gets out the door so he can get his hand in the cookie jar. Yeah,
and he's probably thinking about playing on his computer game or something like that before his mum went out the door, but now all of a sudden the law's put that thought in his mind that wasn't even there before.
Yeah. Now, you say we only need to go to the New Testament for examples of trying to live the Christian life under the power of legalism, but didn't Paul have to admonish the Galatians because they came back under the law? He said that having begun in the Spirit, they tried to be made perfect by the flesh?
Yeah, that's right. And I think this is a common fallacy, Phil. I think sometimes, you hear about people that say that grace must be balanced by the law. I don't know if you've ever heard that before. Now, the question is, okay, what are you going to balance it with? What are you going to balance grace with? If the answer is law, well, then straight away grace is no longer grace. That's what Paul says in Romans chapter 11 and verse 6. He says, if it's by grace, then it's no longer by law. Otherwise, grace is no longer grace. If it's by law, then it's no longer by grace. Otherwise, law is no longer law. You can't mix law and grace. You mix one little bit of law with grace, and grace is no longer grace. So for grace to be effective in people's lives, it has to be radical.
Yeah.
And I love that word radical grace, because grace is pure grace. Paul says that the true gospel is the power of God unto salvation. We try to find power in things like prayer and fasting and doing this and doing that, more power to us,
Yeah.
Paul says, no, you get a hold of the true gospel. He says that is the power of God unto salvation. But you come under law, and law nullifies the grace of God. It cancels it out because grace is no longer grace. And a lot of Christians try to live their lives by law without realizing it. They try to come under law in governing their finances, in working out their marriage, in their Christian walk. And every time that we come under law, we cancel out the grace of God. We fall from grace. Paul uses that term. We fall from grace. And he says, Christ is of no effect to you. Once you come under the law, Christ is of no effect to you in that area of your life. You've cancelled out the grace of God. God's the power of God's grace working, and you're trying to work it all out now in your union with these rules or these laws, these regulations that you've married yourself to,
And one you touched on there, I think, is a great example for all of us that we'll very easily understand, and that's money.
Yeah.
The law says, tithe 10%, discharge your obligation. But grace says open-handed generosity.
Yeah. Be
generous to those that are around you.
Yeah.
Be generous in your giving.
Yeah.
And it's a mindset. It's totally different.
Yeah, this whole thing of tithing, you obviously want to put the cat amongst the pigeons here, Phil, and stir up a hornet's nest, but I'll just say
a couple of minutes left, so I'm sure you can cover it off.
We could do a whole week on tithing, but basically, we've been saying this, that you can always do more under grace than we do by law. So tithing is measured giving. I've given God his 10%. This is all mine.
Well, maybe that's the key to why sometimes we like to go back to the law, because it's our sinful nature that says, well, I don't have to do more. I can keep that, in this case, money or whatever it is, to myself and discharge my obligation.
Yeah.
But the law is null and void now under grace, because we are under grace.
Yeah.
Some people, you might say, are kind of scared of grace.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, I think people have this fear that grace will become a license to sin. I hear this all the time. Even Paul was charged with that. He says, people are saying that Paul is teaching, let's continue in sin that grace may abound. But he goes on to say, God forbid, I'm not teaching that at all.
Yeah.
And, you hear these terms like cheap grace. Well, grace isn't cheap, actually. It's very expensive. It cost God his only son. There's nothing cheap about grace. It's free to us.
Yeah.
But it was very expensive to God. Some people talk about greasy grace. These kind of sayings sound very spiritual, but you can come back on that and say, well, what about lethal legalism? Because legalism kills.
Yeah.
But we don't want to get in that kind of game. The fact is that grace is not a license to sin. It is the only thing that can get us out of sin. Paul says sin will not have dominion over you. Why? Because you are not under the law, but under grace. That's the reason why we can live above sin, because we're in grace. You bring a person back under law, and they're going to struggle with sin.
Yeah.
But they're going to have a real battle on their hands, because it's a bad marriage. There's no power in the law to set us free from sin. The power is in the life of Christ.
Surely it's open to abuse.
It is, and so is the law, by the way, but it is open to abuse. But here's the thing. If you do come across someone that has this attitude, okay, I'm under grace, so I can just live like I like now, I can send it up and do whatever I want,
Yeah.
If you do come across somebody like that, and I don't actually think I've met too many people that have taken that message and used it as an excuse for sinful living. But if you do come across someone like that, does that mean then that we just stop preaching grace? No, what we do is we go to that person and we say, hey, brother or sister, I don't know what you've got there and what you're believing in, but it's not grace, because sin will not have dominion over you when you're under grace. So whatever you've got there, it's not the grace of God. Don't call that the grace of God. You've got licentiousness or something like that, but you don't have grace. Grace will set you free from sin, not give you an excuse to live in sin. But don't stop preaching grace just because one person might be abusing it.
Ken Legg's been helping us to escape from legalism this week, and we'll have more tomorrow. Until then, remember, you don't have to carry that baggage, because God wants you to be set free.
Find articles and more set-free podcasts in the free Vision Christian Media app or at vision.org.au.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.